Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. If you've been following my episodes, you have probably seen that I've covered the white sands footprints in New Mexico and the dating surrounding them. The white sands footprints are currently dated, or at least thought to be dated, to something like 20 to 23,000 years ago, which would turn everything we know about the peopling of North America on its head. But I'm here to tell you that the footprints found in White Sands, New Mexico are not alone. And footprints are found in basins in other places across North America. And people have been working on dating them as well to see if perhaps we can replicate the findings at White Sands. And so today I'm bringing on Dr. Daron Duke. He is an archaeologist working in Utah. Hi, Daron. Welcome to the channel.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Daron, I've learned that you have found some footprints in Utah, very, very old footprints from Native Americans. And you have been researching these footprints and trying to date them, learn about the people that were there and the styles of technology they were using to survive. And so I want to start off our conversation today with you describing the place where you found the footprints and a little bit of the background on the site. And then let's talk about the ages of these footprints and other artifacts and perhaps other footprints from other species found at the site. So the footprints, where are they found?
So the footprints are in the Great Salt Lake Desert, which is in the Lake Bonneville Basin. You know, it's basically the muddy bottom of what was Lake Bonneville in the Pleistocene. And at the end of the Pleistocene, technically what we'd call the first and the highest stand of the Great Salt Lake kind of came up over that area. But as it went away, essentially as Lake Bonneville itself drained away, water from around the basin was coming into the basin and created just a humongous deltaic marshland and full of channels, ponds, streams, all this kind of stuff. And as bleak as it is now in the Great Salt Lake Desert, to anyone who's driven through there, it would have been, it's huge. That's one thing. And at the time, it would have been a huge wetland, hugest around. We refer to it as the old riverbed delta. There's something called the old river that's a dead river that cuts and drains into it. And but that's been dead since, at least 12,000 years ago, or 10 to 12,000 years ago. So what has been basically useless land to native peoples for millennia, effectively was like the best place to be over 10,000 years ago. And so that's where it is. Maybe the related question would be, why are there footprints there? The whole basin's been scoured out by wind for that dry last 10,000 years. And I've been working out there for over 20 years. I should mention my colleague, Craig Young, who's not here today, but he's kind of the geoarchaeologist. And in tandem, we have worked with our company, Far Western Anthropological Research Group, for the military, doing surveys, and we've recorded hundreds of early period sites, say terminal Pleistocene, early Holocene transition to about 10 to 9,000 years ago. I probably personally walked over some 60 to 100,000 acres. I worked on it on my PhD dissertation, but only recently, in the last 10 years, did we find this area where there's some remnant preservation. And I could describe that a little bit if you want me to, but this is where the footprints are. It's also where an amazing Haskett archaeological record is.
Okay. So today it's almost, I've seen the pictures. It seems like it's almost inhospitable desert, like you said, almost useless land for Native Americans. But something you're saying like 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, when it was a marshy environment and probably full of animals and plants that would have been useful for native peoples in that area. So Can you explain why did the lake dry out?
Well, toward the end of the Pleistocene, Lake Bonneville started to decline, and it was hanging in strong there 14, 15,000 years ago, and then that's really when it started to dry up. Of course, we had a warm period called the bowling Allerod. It seems to have gone a long way down. The Younger Dryas that I think you know about, that's a period between about, 11,700 and 13,000 years. The lake came back up, but it was this kind of, Lake Bonneville went away. So we kind of start referring to things as the Great Salt Lake at that point. Came up into the southern part of the Great Salt Lake Desert. Again, so more lake is the point, depositing lake-like sediments. But after that retreated, we really got this kind of gangbusters, just influx of water that wasn't reaching a lake. A lake kind of went away. But still, there's so much water locked up in the geology of the area just from the Pleistocene and the lake. This continued to issue out onto the basin floor. So what you had is this big distributary channel, kind of deltaic marshland that was quite huge. And
Okay,
it
yeah.
would have been, wetland plants, huge waterfowl kind of corridor, and presumably animals, of all sorts be drawn to the water. But now, as you point out, it's bleak. We
Mhm.
find stone projectile points followed by military level bullet casings, and it's sort of a classic archaeology. You go from this age to that age kind of thing. They're all laying out there, and that's why it's a military range. Basically, there's not agrable land; it's just a mud
Mhm.
flat.
Okay. And this is, must have been pretty shallow water because people were clearly walking across it, but it was wet. So let's maybe talk about the footprints and how did you initially come across them?
Well, I came across them out of curiosity about the White Sands prints. Basically,
Hmm,
I
interesting.
took note of the similar context. And I was gonna dig a site that, prefacing that a little bit, we'd been working on this Haskett record, which we had figured out was kind of emerging out of the preserved strata already. And we had found a site called the Wishbone site that was a campfire. I mean, it's being shaved off by erosion, but it was still intact and quite perfectly intact. There's not lots of shrubs or burrowing animals out in this place. So, despite the fact it's wind is shaving those off at the top, what was beneath was a perfect representation of really people eating ducks, throwing the bones
Mm,
down, and among other things. In fact, the earliest evidence for people's use of tobacco,
mm,
1,300 years ago, was the calibrated radiocarbon date we got on it with several pieces. And so we knew that things are eroding out, and that we had immense preservation. And I was going to dig another site I thought might be like Wishbone. It wasn't, but I thought, can I find footprints? I mean, we have the integrity. And what I did was reached out to a guy named Thomas Urban. He's the guy who did GPR, ground penetrating radar at White Sands. And I thought that might be the best way to attack it. He was the one I reached out to. And I was worried about troubling him or bothering him about it, but oh no, the White Sands people were very interested and presumed there would be other cases. They sort of needed to know another one. So he was happy to come out. He came out, and this is just serendipitous. The way they were found, again, we didn't need GPR. He eyeballed them out the side of the truck. No kidding.
wow. Oh my God.
Um, we were on the first day. We were going out to the main area, and I was asking him. We were just starting to talk about it. His head was already on a swivel because of similar context. He was happy to be out there. And then I literally asked him, well, what do they look like? And he just said, well, they look kind of like that, sort of pointed out the window. And that's where we found them. Now, it's incredibly crazy to know that what he saw was a trackway of about 10 prints, looked like humans walking. My first thought was that was one of our crews a few years ago. It's been wet outside and
Hmm.
nothing. So, but we looked into it, and to make this kind of long story a little bit shorter, they're real. Even more unique is now that that was 2022, summer of 2022. And since then, I've been out there every year. I have yet to see Even among all the footprints we found, those are the best ones. Also, I have not seen even those go invisible. I have never seen them that nicely visible. Nothing has compared to the moment he actually laid eyes on those. The route I
Wow.
took in the truck, I've walked all over the place. We've never found anything quite so vivid. Archaeology, a lot of archaeological science has been based on that sort of luck. But, luck is the residue of something, design, experience, patience. I don't know, all those things people say, but like I've been out there for years and years and years. So you just kind of hone in and maybe we just let luck happen and there you go.
Yeah, that is lucky. And so he points to the footprints, and you're saying it's near a hearth so this is like a circular feature of rocks with charcoal in it that was being used to probably cook ducks, keep people warm. And this hearth, you're saying, had Haskett points and tobacco found in it or near it that you said dated to something like 12,000 years ago. What are Haskett points, and how did you know that there was tobacco being used or grown there?
Well, the Wishbone site, is about a quarter of a mile from these footprints. It's not,
Okay.
this is not a footprints that would lead to the site or necessarily anything like that. But what they do share is stratigraphic context that we spent a few years trying to make sure we could establish. And so that's the kind of associated time window and who was out there at the time. So we don't have a footprint with a Haskett point in it or anything like that. But the Wishbone site had two Haskett points at it, and it wasn't rock lined. There's no rocks out there really, unless somebody brought them in the form
Okay,
of
it wasn't.
tools usually. But it is just a charcoal. It was kind of big. It's about a meter. It looked like something someone used multiple days, not just an overnighter. But actually one of the Haskett points is a broken fragment that they threw half of in the fire and half of is laying outside of it. They refit. Somebody may have just gotten frustrated. Those of us who tried to make stone tools, we know what
Mhm.
that's like. The other one's a really perfect example of a Haskett point, about a meter from the edge of the hearth in the kind of throw zone of bones, pretty much mallard bones.
Mm.
So we know that we've worked quite a bit on the stratigraphic situation of all this stuff, and we have this kind of area that's several hundred square acres that all this material is coming out of, and the footprints now sort of figure in all.
Okay, and so the term Haskett point is new to me. I've heard of Clovis, I've heard of the Plano points and other kind of points, but what is Haskett? What makes them unique, and when are they dated to?
Haskett is a point of what we call out west the Western stem tradition. It is perhaps not the earliest projectile point in the Americas, but it is kind of the initiating stem point in the Great Basin and where we're working. And it's a big lanceolate point, kind of like a Clovis point. But instead of being designed with a flute, it's sort of designed with a tapering long stem. And it looks like people, kind of manage the breakage of these things down the stem. That's part of the design, but they're very well crafted. They're part of that early complex. If you just took Clovis and Haskett, said, "Oh, it's the end of the Pleistocene," without sweating, which one came first, or a couple hundred years of date error, you just say they're part of the big game-looking technology complex that's going on in North America. And we didn't
Hmm.
know much about them for a long time because the dated sites out west are so few. They tend to be at the bottom of rock shelters, whether you directly date them or not. They're part of the bottom of the sequence or the earliest part of the sequence. And now dates have gotten better. Certainly, the Haskett component on the old riverbed is really a important case study for it. But they're very serious piece of weaponry, I think.
You're saying it's part of the toolkit, or one style of point that was clearly used for not a bow and arrow, but a larger spear, maybe, that was probably used for hunting large animals.
Yeah, I
Mm.
mean, there's a lot to be desired from the Haskett record, including like a Haskett point sticking out of any animal, frankly. We have ducks at the Wishbone site. Doesn't look like they needed a Haskett point to bring those ducks down. But, ducks could be daily food anyway. It doesn't
Mhm.
mean anything necessarily about Haskett points, but the tools associated with Haskett points are also big, butchery looking tools. And so something was out here that they were targeting. And, that's kind of the compelling part of what work needs to be done. I won't say that I know for sure anything I don't know for sure, but from a technological standpoint, they are in kind with Clovis. They probably were used similar to Clovis points in that they kind of get used for projectiles, and then it looks like a lot of them get transitioned into some sort of knife or other kind of tool as they break. Maybe they get repurposed and reshaped.
Okay. And also at the same site, you found evidence for tobacco use. Can you talk about what was that evidence that you found, and how old was it again?
We found the hearth. We dated the hearth based on charcoal in it, willow wood charcoal. There's no willow growing out there now, but that'd be about the woodiest plant in the wetlands, even today. And we got multiple dates at about 12,300 calibrated years. If you know anything about this, the calibration curve of radiocarbon at the time is pretty challenging. So the error on that would give you more of a 12,500 to 12,100 sort of time frame that you're in. It was perfectly intact. So we took everything out of the hearth and took it back to our labs and did flotation and looked at everything in it, every seed, everything. And we identified 4 tobacco seeds. Angela Armstrong Ingram on the paper, she's the one that actually identified them. Tobacco seeds grow naturally, but not in a wetland. This would be the desert variety of tobacco that grows regionally, but they like sandy, rocky kind of outcrop soils in the mountains 10 miles away in the middle of a wetland. So why were they there? Actually seeds don't contain any nicotine. So was a little bit of a question, but it doesn't, the seeds are so small. They're like less than a millimeter that they
Mhm.
come along for the ride in a lot of places. And certainly later sites, last couple thousand years, have tobacco seeds sometimes in them. They just sort of come along for the ride with the tobacco that people are packing. Anyway, we had to look into that because the other previously documented evidence for human use of tobacco would be from pipe residues in the southeast United States that got to about 3,300 years old.
Hmm.
But these seeds are so small, the preservation and near anaerobic conditions of I say the mud flats out there, you walk around on them and everything, but they're damp. They stay that way perpetually. And, so everything was preserved. And we went and we took samples of what we call black mats, just these layers, really the old layers at the bottom of the marsh, kind of the mud, muck. We took quite a few samples from those of different ages, trying to find if there was any tobacco seeds in them to rule out, any natural contribution to the hearth. But there was none, and so it looks like a cultural contribution to the hearth, in short.
Okay. Now, is there a possibility they could have been blown in or been part of ducks' intestines, or that, the ducks were eating tobacco, or anything like that?
Well, we looked into that one too. It would be toxic to ducks. I mean, frankly, it'd be toxic to you if you ate tobacco. It's not, the whole plant is designed to not have that happen unless you're a certain hornworm or something. And ducks don't hang out on scraggly mountains when there's, 1,000 square kilometers of their primary food source right there, like pondweed. And, so it's really hard to, they say, defend that. If that was the idea, it'd be hard to defend. Everything's working against it. The Now tobacco is kind of invasive if there's burning, but we're not near, only within its natural kind of habitat. We're a long way from that. So it's just really hard to explain otherwise. One possibility I think is going on is, I put this in our paper, and I don't know this, of course, but uh, that people may have been not smoking it, or they probably did all these things with tobacco at one time or another. They smoked, put it in your mouth, ingest it otherwise. But there are these things, little things called quids, I don't know where the name comes from, but it's something archaeologists have identified in rock shelters a lot. It's really like pouch tobacco. The people get something like yucca fibers and put uh, their recipe for something like tobacco in those things and put them in their lip and then discard them. And some of these things actually have tooth marks on them if you're in caves. In fact, Danger Cave, which is nearby, has a long record of those quids being deposited in the cave. Not quite, the record doesn't go back as far as 12,000, but it goes back to, over 9,000. There are quids in that cave. So it's a reasonable working hypothesis to say that people were spitting quids into the fire.
Mm,
And
okay.
one of my co-authors, Karen Adams, who's worked with tobacco for a long time. She analyzed quids from another cave down the Arizona-Utah border, examined the contents, and 90% of them had tobacco in them. So I think you connect the dots, and there's just a long-term use of tobacco is not surprising. Uh, and whatever manner the seeds got into the hearth, it's just really, frankly, I couldn't have asked for a better context to have to argue it's not natural input than in the middle of the biggest open muddy basin in the West to exclude, natural habitat in here. Why would you expect the duck to be eating tobacco or any of that kind of stuff? So it's a
Okay.
strong case.
Yeah. Were you able to obtain any radiocarbon dates on the seeds themselves?
I toyed with the idea of it, but they're so fragile and so small that we had solid dates out of the hearth and everything's got such intact context that we would have had to try some extreme and destructive
Mm.
methods to even give it a whirl. Yeah, there's really doesn't seem to be any upside to that.
Mm. So this would then push back the age of drug use, or I mean, let's say tobacco or drug use, back really to the first peopling of North America. What's the other? You said the other old date for tobacco use was like in 3,000 years ago.
Yeah, 9,000 years later. But, to be honest, when I had this, the reason we looked into so many options, possibilities was because I go, these people who study tobacco are going to have my head. I'm just going to come in there and say, oh, I have found some and they're 9,000 years older than yours, And in fact, no, it was the opposite. Their opinion was more of a no duh, thanks for
Mhm.
finding it because we would, based on everything from, indigenous knowledge and a tradition, people should have been using this for the extent that they were here, right? And so tobacco is a very fragile, annual plant. It's like, unless it's the domesticated stuff, the seeds are puny. What the other evidence is residue from smoking pipes. So if you say you have residue from a smoking pipe, you have to account for how many years was it that people knew how to smoke that they developed the technology of smoking pipes. You don't look at it like
Mhm.
the date, in the same way. You got all this investment in smoking tobacco by 3,300 years would be another way to look at it.
Mhm.
And that's with agrarian cultures in the Southeast, so we are, you know, what it is, I think, would be traditional ecological knowledge going back a long way to people who understood all the kind of small seed complex stuff that is out here, what to use it for. I'm sure they learned quickly that it could be expanded with burning in the right places. So it does kind of like shore up a loose end where you just imagine, people should have known all these things. There were a few other seeds in the heart that look like they're cultural contributions, probably dietary. And there's some goosefoot in there. It's kind of like quinoa.
Mhm.
And I can't remember off the top of my head what else. The hearth had a pretty good cultural component.
So, like a good representation of plants that were being brought to the site that weren't living in the marshy area. And so it's clear humans were bringing not only projectile points, and eating ducks, but they were also bringing plants with them. So it makes sense they bring the tobacco. Thinking about it more, it's like maybe chewing tobacco preceded smoking tobacco. And they realized that smoking gives you a bigger rush than the chewing or something, and later on develop that technology, just as like a speculation.
I mean, maybe, or they probably within their culture did all of those things for different purposes at different times. Uh, there's everything from casual use to probably ceremonial or sorts of uses, and they may be different depending.
Now,
We
okay.
compared the hearth contents to organic samples of wetland. What seeds do we get in all these black mat mucks? And what did we get? We got cattails and bulrush and pondweed, something ducks eat a lot of, but we didn't get all these other things. So the cultural profile of seeds is definitely different than the natural profile of seeds.
Yeah, that I did see that in your paper. So that's interesting that you did a control at the nearby sediments to see, the assemblages of those seeds, and it shows that definitely the hearth had seeds that were, let's call them anthropogenic, or brought there from elsewhere. So that kind of strengthens the argument, certainly, that not just a random event, not just blown in, not just duck food, that people were utilizing plants at that site. But now, are these seeds charred? Any evidence? They are charred. Okay.
Yeah, they're charred.
And I'm sure you would have mentioned it, there's no pipes found anywhere nearby.
No,
Dated to this time. Okay. Now,
it's possible people use bird bones as kind of small scale pipes. That's been done before.
mhm,
I actually kind of looked for that in the assemblage, but we didn't see anything of it like it.
okay. Now, the hearth, which is dated to the median calibrated age is 12,300 calendar years before present. Now, this is a quarter mile away from where you found the footprints. Now, let's get back into that. So, the footprints, you could see them out the window of the car. I mean, or at least like maybe indentations, but did you did you have to excavate down to actually see the bottom of the footprint? And how deep were they? And maybe can you tell us, is there evidence they're wearing shoes or sandals, or were they barefoot or anything like that?
Yeah, so I mean, initially, Tommy and I talked it out. We started measuring. He did GPR to see what these would represent like on a GPR output, and he was able to see that. But the key was to get in there and see what they were by excavation. Actually, he was nice. He connected me up with Dave Bustos, and I had a quick thread on email with Matt Bennett, who is the footprint specialist. Bustos came out, sort of showed us some things he'd done, photogrammetry, and some of his recording methods. Tommy was only there a few days. He left, and I was stuck by myself. I remember spending a whole day just kind of on my belly. I was afraid to dig him. I tested, what am I doing here with some modern kind of animal prints and things I found. And they were superficial because there is no deposition out there. Somebody steps in the mud or an animal steps in the mud, it just leaves a, kind of indentation, and then it doesn't get infilled, and it just goes away, slides away almost. Seasonally, there's so much water out there, it just turns into nothing. Eventually, it's like, and it was Matt Bennett who said, I kind of asked him, like, how do you do that? He goes, you're just going to have to jump in there and not worry about it. You got to figure it out. So I was like, okay. So we had seen these tracks. I said there was a trackway of 10 prints in sequence. That's what Tommy had eyeballed out of the truck. But as we looked around, we were able to record like 88 footprints that we saw at that time. And there are a few trackways. There's other mixing. They're kind of like people milling around, sort of looking stuff. But I dug a few, and then I finally dug one in the main area that I just knew was a footprint. So the difference is these are flush with the surface. Okay. We don't have the white sands problem of gypsum and, lithifying substrates and all that. This is like mud that's still mud. Okay. So what I figured out is digging them, they are sand filled and they go pretty deep. Some of them go 6 inches deep. People go in ankle deep sometimes, everything from just like right by the water or entering the water to kind of like walking around in some real mud and slipping and sliding. They get pretty deep and they actually, as scary as it sounds to dig a footprint, at first it seemed that way. It sounds like it would be subjective, is frankly what it sounds like. Like you think you can dig out some toes, and how are you going to do that? Well, these people were in like a stream or a pond or something with a sandy bottom, and when they stepped in the substrate mud and pulled their foot out, just immediately all this sand rushed in. And you've seen
Mhm,
that happen on a beach. We even had a few
mhm,
examples. You can see the little rivulet cutting the back of the print as water filled it in.
mm,
So that gives us a pretty interesting angle. For one, it was easy. Well, I'm not going to say easy. It was straightforward once you learned it, how to dig them because it's like belly work with a wooden tool. But you can hear the sand, you can feel the sand, and then the minute you can feel mud, you stop. And even when you can't kind of see down in there, you just trust it. And in the end, you get this footprint. And so that's how we dug them.
mhm.
And we got savvier. We didn't see anything in the sand. Sand is usually not the best place to go find organic materials that you would date because it filters out of it. But after a while, I got to figure, where does it have to go? These prints are like little storage jars. And if the sand is what they were stepping in and its detritus is from approximately the time that they were there, then if I could find that stuff in the infills, then I should get it out and try to date it.
Okay. And because of this kind of infilling, you really can't discern toes. You don't know if they had sandals on. It's just more of a, broad shape of a human foot. I'll put up some pictures of the ones you sent me because when you see the white sands footprints, they seem to have these distinctive toes to them. And, but you just don't see that at your Utah site. And I think that's kind of an interesting observation.
Well, on some of them, we get very distinct toes. It's just that they've slid down and then sometimes they undercut. So we
Oh,
do get
okay.
toes. We got
You do get,
toes. I mean, we get some blobby looking ones as well, but uh, we do get toes. It's just not as vivid. And we did some 3D scanning of the excavated prints, and you kind of see people take their forefoot lunging forward. So we had a lot of prints where they go like this before someone steps forward, and their toes will go like under into the mud. I mean, they're getting in some pretty deep mud. So you see some of these 3D scans, and you can see big toes and you can kind of see it. And our most vivid ones have toes, but others, if there's a little more sand in the matrix, it kind of blurs those lines a little bit on some of them. Yeah,
okay.
people slide and yeah. But about the white sand sprints, yeah, they have some kind of they look a little odd. Some archaeologists have said to me, those toes don't look right, at white sands. I'm a little more forgiving of that. I think it's not easy to dig footprints, having dug them, and so I don't discount the footprints of white sand. Ours don't look like theirs. I don't know this really exactly, but I think that you had people and fauna walking along a lake margin, and kind of doing your classic beach foot thing, leaving a flat print. We had people stepping in some substantial mud. They may have been working the marsh, collecting things, doing things. It's not like a big trackway. People are going somewhere. It's a area people are in, and they're stepping in the water to do things. And some of these get pretty deep, so we have all that to work with. It just looks a little different.
Okay. And it seems, like you mentioned the gypsum too, the muds are different in the white sands, and that might help preserve shapes a little bit differently than the muds you have in Utah. And so there could be other factors at play that affect that preservation. Now, the footprints themselves, what size would they be in like equivalent US shoe sizes today?
I don't know if I can reel off shoe sizes right here, but certainly under a 10. I mean, you can kind of determine stature of people by footprint size. It turns out that your footprint will be about 15% of your height, believe it or
Oh,
not.
wow.
And these are small people. It looks like it's adults and children. They're infants or toddler level prints out there. So we have evidence of kind of like family units out there by way of family footprints. Like I'll say toddler to about the tallest, or like someone who'd be 5'5", but almost everything is under 5'2".
It's interesting. So smaller statured people, under smaller feet, I guess, for an American male size, I guess. My feet are size 12, and so you're, yeah, maybe on the smaller end, let's say.
Yeah, the Ghost Shoot came out there. The Ghost Shoot kind of liked that fact because they recognize themselves to be small people. That's kind of what their heritage is.
Okay, and that's the nearby tribe.
Yeah.
Are the foot sizes the same as the foot sizes at White Sands?
To be honest, I haven't really like taken a close look at that.
Okay. Now, the next thing I'm wondering is you were able to date these footprints and with the infill. Now, maybe can you talk about how you did that? What did you date? How many dates? And what was our calibrated ages on those?
Yeah, so the main trackway site was kind of a big deal and everything. It has the more pristine footprints in it, but it was the second site that we got a date out of one of the infills on. It's more like bulk organic, so it was not exactly what you want usually, but it gave a date of about 11,800 or 900, something like that. It'd be like the very end of the Pleistocene. But within our stratigraphic window that we've established,
Hmm.
the I found another second site, and it is like less than 300 feet, 100 meters from the Wishbone site. And I dug a print there that just it wasn't as pretty, but it went really deep and had all kinds of stuff in it. And those things included various charcoal, including some seed casing type stuff of like bulrush, I believe. It had cattail pollen in it. It had actually little fish vertebra, like a ray bone in it, freshwater mollusks. So we had all this organic material that it's kind of what you expect at the bottom of a pond or a stream. Technically, it would date, if it's dead, it would date older than the print, but probably within radiocarbon tolerances, error. It's roughly
Hmm.
the timing that people were there. So we dated the charcoal. We got 3 samples of charcoal we dated, and we got very good convergent dates of. And because I'm on this video, I don't have my rundown in front of me, but it was like 12,600 to in that neighborhood. So I was kind of surprised by that. That's really old, and I know that it's limited by a stratigraphic layer we have beneath the prints. That is that I told you the Great Salt Lake came up. We call it the Curry Lake cycle, and it had a lakeshore marsh around it. I just laid this black mat out, and we have like something like almost 20 dates on that. We have it strongly established at about 12,700. So we know how people had to be out there after that. That's the early limiting, and these footprints just date immediately after it. We have all this Haskett archaeology around. We have the Wishbone site. So the working idea is that these are the people who are following the wetland distributary channels out to the receding lake. They probably saw that lake that used to be where they were walking. It may have been pushed a little north on its way out the door eventually before the Pleistocene was out.
That's interesting. You have the sediment deposits that are kind of well established below, so at least gives you that early limited date of 12,700, and then having the discrete microfossils to date is definitely a superior way to date something versus the bulk, because this is the issue. The hard water issue is the problem with white sands, and it's a problem with dating and anything in a lake, a hard water lake sediment period with limestone in the catchment, is that the hard water, so dead carbon that's dissolved out of the limestone, which dead carbon just means radioactive free carbon that's dated to a long time ago, can contaminate your bulk dates. And sometimes plants growing within the water, like aquatic macrophytes, and it will produce artificially old dates in the bulk or the aquatic macrophytes. But you found, you said charcoal that you were able to date in one of these footprints, right?
Yeah, I should qualify that. Charcoal is something we see a lot of, I think, from burning. I mean, one possibility that it was indigenous burning, but these dry components on the wetland appear to have burned. Sometimes we find like windrow strata with charcoal from just burned components on the, not necessarily, not a hearth, not anything you directly identify as human, but there's little loose charcoal floating around, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
From, that's not uncommon.
Yeah, I've seen tons of I mean, if you analyze lake sediment cores as a common proxy is charcoal, and it's
Mm.
because it blows in there, and you can find 125 to 250 micrometer pieces, and that's big enough for radiocarbon dating. But the thing with the charcoal is we know it's coming from a plant. I would say most likely, I guess you could dry out a wetland and burn the previous wetland plants that are there, but it's coming from the landscape outside of the water. And those plants are actively in equilibrium with the atmosphere. So when you burn them, and they might blow in, or it might be humans transporting willow wood to the site, burning, it's on the bottom of their foot and it gets stuck in the thing. That helps to, I wouldn't say totally eliminates, but it helps to remove the potential for hard water effects on the dates and causing them to be too old. And you combine that with the pre-treatment they do that's standard in labs today, where you do the acid-base acid. You pre-treat the samples to remove bits of limestone, to remove some of the organic humic acids that also could contaminate the sample. So I think that is a strength of your finding, because at White Sands, they're dating mostly rupia seeds. And rupia is a seed from an aquatic macrophyte. And that is growing in the lake, which could be pulling carbon, dead carbon from the lake and not being totally in equilibrium with the atmospheric carbon. And so you just can't totally eliminate the possibility that hard water is causing your date to be a little bit old. And that's been the number one criticism of those rupia dates. It is that hard water effect, but they counter it with saying that the water was not part of the lake, it was running in there. There's stratigraphic context to those dates, that it makes sense that they're that age because they're found in the same stratigraphic layers as the LGM lake sediment, where in this case, you're finding that it's certainly above, let's say, the younger Dryas lake sediments. But altogether, I think that's a really, strong case that these dates from footprints are from the late Pleistocene, which is remarkable in itself. And so the second thing I'm wondering, if it's from the late Pleistocene, do you find evidence for footprints of extinct megafauna at the site?
Well, we have, okay, you actually asked a few questions that I'll get around to. That
Sorry.
one, yeah, we mostly have human prints, and we have a couple of kind of ungulate prints, like maybe deer, pronghorn type things that are out there.
Okay. They're
We
still
have
out
one
there today.
print that is compellingly close to looking like a bison. We've gone around about this. I think we have a bison print, but not, mostly. It's like these things are so lightweight. If it's not a mammoth print or a giant sloth print or some of these things they have down there at White Sands, if you imagine the footprints, everything from birds to humans would be like the heaviest thing walking around. Even a heavy bison doesn't leave a big footprint. They have kind of small feet. So we don't have a lot of that. I tried excavating I kind of skimmed the big area, roll it back, and thought maybe I'll see these little sand infills of smaller critters that you wouldn't otherwise be able to to see just at random. And I did get pocketed sand, but I just couldn't make it out to be anything specific. So we do have some, not many would be the answer.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay. And, that, because I was kind of interested in if you found mammoth or ground sloth or something like that, or maybe dire wolf or smilodon, because if you saw something like that, those, as far as I'm aware, are extinct by the Younger Dryas, at least in the La Brea tar pits. This is the only place I'm kind of familiar with. And so if you had found, let's say, mammoth prints near your prints, that would suggest your dates might have been too young because mammoths would have been gone. But the absence of ground sloth, mammoths, etc., is then also strengthens the argument that your dates do date to like post Younger Dryas. Now, the interesting thing here is White Sands has ground sloth prints nearby. Um, that's the only one I remember them talking about, but ground sloth is still a megafauna.
camel. Yeah, they have
Yeah,
camel.
I think camel. Yeah, camel. And so the fact that they found the megafauna prints near their footprints is supportive evidence that those footprints are from, maybe 20,000 years ago. But the problem also is no one exactly knows when those were extirpated from New Mexico. La Brea has a good record of megafauna extinctions, but exactly the regional extinctions, extirpation is the word, is not well understood. So, you could have had pockets of camels in New Mexico all the way up to 13,000, 14,000 years ago, or they could have been gone 20,000 years ago. We just don't have any idea the exact regional extinctions of these exact megafauna, but it seems as though they're all gone after the Younger Dryas. That's, I think, fairly well established. There's no mammoth dates post Younger Dryas. So again, this is interesting. You don't see megafauna at your site. They do see megafauna at White Sand site. So something to ponder for those listening about, the dates on the White Sands versus this one. But I do think your dates are stronger because you did find charcoal and other microfossils that at least reduce that chance of hard water effect.
Yeah, I mean, I should say, I don't rule out megafauna on the
Okay.
old riverbed. We have some compelling, I like to call them circular anomalies that we're kind of scratching our heads over right now that may be mammoth prints. But we're in the time zone for mammoth. It's just some people split hairs, say, well, we don't have evidence in the Great Basin, but we have evidence over here. I don't know. We certainly have the technology, I guess, would be one way of looking at it. But I can't say necessarily what was not there, right? It doesn't, even the footprints, they're very, white sand seems to have a very repeatable kind of situation to it. I've got a more nuanced preservation problem. They have a systemic or reveal of this shoreline, and then they have some stratigraphy that goes down. We have just what's left of what's eroding away. It's kind of discontinuous and harder to map onto like that. But we do have a lake there, but that lake, the lake where we have is freshwater lake. Clearly, it had a marshland around the edge of it, and that doesn't seem to be the case at White Sands. Rupia certainly grows in Utah. We have zero evidence for any rupia in the old riverbed wetlands. We have hard water. I've dated shell out there, which has the same problem as the rupia seeds. And we know that they date early. And in fact, the shells in the footprint that I just described, I dated them, even though I expected them to be too old. The main thing was I didn't expect them to be younger than the radiocarbon date on the charcoal. And sure enough, those shells came back 500 to 1,000 years older than the charcoal dates.
Bingo. That's a radiocarbon reservoir effect.
Yeah, we've seen that before. So I thought it'd be an interesting way to, even though it gives you a wrong date, like It's kind of a control.
No, I mean, I'm a sediment guy, and, I've seen studies where they take charcoal, they take ostracods or, shells of carbonate producing organisms in the lake. And if you do enough of that, sometimes you can see a systematic offset between the charcoal and those shells, and you can calculate the radiocarbon reservoir effect of that body of water over time if you can establish enough dates. And that could help you in the future if you might find a circular shaped footprint that you might want to date, and all that's in there are shells, and you date them and they come back to 20,000 years ago. You could say, well, we established a radiocarbon reservoir effect that's less than 1,000 years. So that even if it's a date of a shell there, that's that would still put it, you could calculate that offset and put it at 19,000 years ago. But then also this brings in, you have to account for the lake level changes, because during the LGN, if the volume of the lake is a lot bigger, the radiocarbon reservoir effect is going to be different than a shallow lake with a lot less volume. So you kind of have to assume the volumes are about the same to keep that consistent reservoir effect there. But I'm so glad that you brought that up. You looked into the radiocarbon reservoir effect, which is amazing. And you found that, yeah, that's actually a pretty small, I would say, reservoir effect, considering I don't know exactly the size of Lake Bonneville and its, predecessors, but I'm pretty sure
Well,
it's
these
a
would
pretty
be
big lake.
shells in the wetland. There would be no lake at the time. They'd be
Oh, in the wetland.
shell, mollusks that are going up and down the, plants, in and out of the
Okay.
water. There seems to be, because it's never mattered much for me as the archaeologist. I haven't done, there's plenty of things to research, not, the long radiocarbon reservoir effects of shells but I have noticed that, and this is Jeff Pigatti, I think, wrote this, unrelated to white sands, but like the smaller shells seem to have less of it than the bigger shells. Like they just don't uptake as much. They don't have as much need. The creatures themselves don't have as much need to suck as much carbon out. And I've actually kind of noticed that pattern. Like the smaller species have less reservoir effect.
Mm, mm.
It's more like neat, and if one wanted to go down and do what you're talking about, there are some angles there, I think.
Yeah, that has to do, I think, partly with how long the shell takes to form. Like an ostracod is one of these really, really small bivalves. They form a shell over like 1 year, and they don't live very long. Where if you have something like a clam or a mussel, proper clam mussel shell, they can live over multiple seasons. And I think then probably incorporate, I wouldn't know exactly how that works, but that seems to check out with the understanding of how the shells work. Because even when you look at the isotopes, if you're doing like a paleoclimate study, we kind of want to target ostracods because they form their shells very fast and incorporate the water chemistry of that like year, that season. Whereas you don't want to take shells from like a gastropod, like a snail, because they can go up and down the water column, live multiple years, they can move quite a bit. And a big proper mussel or clam, that shell is being produced over multiple seasons. So it's integrating different water chemistries and just making it more complicated. So that checks out. And I'm glad it's just glad to hear that you're looking into the exciting science of radiocarbon reservoir effects at the site.
Well, we want to prove ourselves wrong ultimately, right? We're doing
Yeah.
science.
Eliminate all the possibilities. Now, you are doing this work. You're an archaeologist. You've been out working in the West. So it seems like to me, you'd be the perfect person to ask about your opinion of white sands, their footprints, and the dating there. And so I just, want to get a handle on, have you looked into the white sands footprints much? And they claim they're dated to 20 to 23,000 years ago. Based on what do you think that make sense, or do you think they need to do maybe more work to convince you?
Well, I have looked at them quite a bit at the prints. I mean, Bustos got me and Craig down there. We got to look at them. I've been on the ground. It's a neat, cool, really cool place to see. Talked a lot to Dave Rochelle and Matt Cuba out there as well. I think that I feel like I'm kind of an archaeologist with 50-yard line seats, and I'm just eating my popcorn while I watch everybody debate all this. And, I only have my site, I don't have
Mhm.
theirs. My opinion is that I think that there is still some questions and they're legit. And Dave Rochelle in particular has the bead on probably the primary one, which is how do you date rupia? How does it yield dates? And what are the fundamental geomorphic processes that explain kind of what's going on at those prints? Now, on the flip side, the team at White Sands has developed like kind of a multiple lines of evidence angle with kind of repeated, OSL, pollen,
Rupia.
rupia, and they get kind of a convergence. So they say, hey, look, how many things do you want us to date? And they all seem to be 20,000 plus years old. So, but, the other team argues that those are wide ranges with wide margins of error, and, the little convergences could be misleading. I'm open to people having been here as long as they, for a long time. But I think, the kind of article sequence recently, there's like unresolved. One team says unresolved. The other team, the Guardian folks say resolved. I mean, these are in the title of their.
Yes, I saw it too.
To watch it, it looks like it's getting a little. For one thing, it's extensive. So I talked to a lot of archaeologists who ask questions about it, and they're kind of getting whiplash from this. Not everybody knows what to make. If it is to boil it down simply, it's like, oh well, we have multiple lines of dated evidence, and the other team's like, well, yeah, but you have this glaring problem with the key thing you dated. So my opinion is that it is still unresolved, and there are
Mhm.
some serious questions of fundamental geoarchaeology that come in to play with how the rupia seeds are integrated and everything else. But that's about as far as I'm willing to take it. As I said, the footprints themselves, the White Sands team, pretty generous. I wouldn't have the prints I have if I hadn't asked. So, but that's kind of irrespective of the scientific question. And
Mhm.
I think there's legitimate scientific question about what's going on with the radiocarbon dating of the White Sands footprints.
And for those that aren't aware, if you haven't been watching my channel for a long time, I brought on Dave Rochelle, who's on the camp of the dating has issues, and his colleagues. And I also brought on Vance Holliday, who wrote one of the papers that supports the dates of the White Sand. So if you are interested in that question or the debate, and you want to hear it from the people writing the papers, I would recommend checking out both of those episodes on my channel and getting it from the mouth of the very scientists that are working on these. Because my opinion from listening to them and, you know, reading the papers myself and just following it, I've just been interested that when I started the channel, the first thing I wanted to do was get them on there, get somebody from that research team on here to talk about this, because if they are really 20 to 23,000 years old, I mean, that changes so much. They're in the interior of North America. They're way older than, let's say, Cooper's Ferry, which is a solidly dated site that's 20,000 or 16,000 years old. But they also are somewhat consistent with Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, which is showing older-ish dates, but I think they're still within that 14 to 16,000 year window. But the dating issue is a problem. Also, Metacroft, with contamination of coal, so the dead carbon effect, at least allegedly, there. But still, 20 to 23,000 years old in White Sands is preceding both of those by thousands of years, and we don't have a radiocarbon date of any artifact in North America, continental North America, that is close to that time. And that's I think, just right off the bat, a big issue. And, just because there is an absence of dates that old that's not evidence of anything. But what I'm trying to say is there is no corresponding supportive evidence for people in the Americas 20 to 23,000 years ago outside of the white sands footprints. No artifacts, no radiocarbon dates, nothing. Would you agree on that part?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the most secure early components are from Cooper's Ferry. That gets you towards 16,000 years ago. There are, there's the coprolites in Nevada that's 14,000 years ago. There's the Deborah Friedkin kind of Galt site stuff down in Texas that gets you over 16,000 years ago. I think I, I remember the name of it up in the Chesapeake area. There's some compelling data coming out that would be similar,
Mm-hmm.
15, 16.
Mm-hmm.
I never underestimate humans, though. And I will say this is kind of, I have two things to contribute probably on my end. One would be the context we have is not like at White Sands. There's some debate, part of the debate that's unresolved in my opinion is this deal about fresh water and hard water and saline water or brackish water, whatever, and how the context of rupia growing. Because I am in a purely freshwater situation. There's no rupia around. And around the edge of our lake, we have, you know, a black mat that's 3 inches deep of muck from cattails, bull, everything you would expect in a freshwater context. So that should be explained if it has anything to do with the dates. But about us looking backwards from these sites we know, and especially this time, say 12 to 13,000 years ago, say about 13,000 years ago when we would put Clovis down. Clovis is the long time, first. People have been talking about Clovis being first forever, for a century almost. What really, I study all this early technology, and Haskett or Clovis, they're both kind of the same thing in the sense they're stone intensive. So they leave a big record. And I think archaeologists even suffer from the idea that stone equals the record of people. Stone may not equal the record of people. We have this, I kind of sometimes call it great stone explosion at about 13,000. And when archaeologists thought it was the first people, they just thought that was their signature. But I think we can throw that away these days. At least I do. I think it's unequivocal people were here prior to that. In which case, you'd have to put this stone explosion in the same category as something, an innovation or a adaptive shift like the emergence of groundstone or, otherwise. And why? That's the question. And something, I guess my little kind of working hypothesis from a technological standpoint is perhaps people had been here for 16,000 or 25,000 years ago, but like in other parts of the world, they just may have not been very stone oriented. Osseous tools, wooden tools, and the need maybe not been there. And there seems to be some evidence for lack of that evidence with other sites. That I think that's a viable possibility. It could have been population levels. People came down the coast, for example. How long did it take them to get a kind of threshold population in the continental interior? Kind of in combination with the decline of these animals, and somehow that sort of initiates this hunting complex through stone. Everybody knows the sources, everybody knows the landscape, you have to have a resident population, in my opinion, to have this stone technology that so well represents the distribution of resources on the interior of the landscape. So I don't take it for granted that when you go back, if you don't find stone, even at White Sands, if you don't find a stone assemblage, that means there was nobody there, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, that's really an interesting way to look at it. And, I have not thought about that before, that maybe stone technologies were adaptive, 16 to 15,000 years ago. And prior to that, they were just maybe using sharpened sticks or throwing just plain rocks at animals, like round rocks or snares
Or,
made out of rope or something,
yeah, or just
or
less of it,
anything. Or
kind of
maybe,
sharp tools, but maybe not the projectile points. One thing about Clovis and Haskett is the heavy investment in the flaking. I mean, and some argue, I like these theories, that they're signaling. It's kind of like they're signaling hunting with them. Like, there's no reason you have to create a Haskett point or a Clovis point to bring down a mammoth. You
Mm,
don't need it.
mm,
So why? It's clearly a hunting complex. The tools go along with the points and give you an example of people using, these animals. But clearly they eat ducks too, and people have been probably eating ducks since forever.
mhm,
So, if game is common, not going extinct, it may not have been such a big deal to signal that you're hunting. But as they started to decline and people are becoming more populous on the landscape, it might have been a little bit different situation to how people's involvement in their actual extinction may have come into play, even if it hadn't a little earlier.
mm,
Because I think most people agree the environment was going to pot. Uh, and it probably, that's a whole debate I certainly don't want to get all,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm the full expert on. I mean, the extinction debate is a huge one. But if I have a critique at all, it's just that, two things can be true at the same time. So it's not either or. The environment, did this or people did this. But these animals were circling the drain. I'm sure humans weren't helping.
Okay, that's
It's an interesting question how these technologies might be part of that story.
okay. I see what you're saying. I'm still just grappling with the idea that, why do we assume these early cultures would even leave stone tips? That assumption itself needs more investigation because these early groups may not have been producing these beautiful stone tip tools, and for whatever reason, and I have heard the other idea that there could have been an early group of humans that came into the Americas at the last glacial maximum. Maybe they just weren't that successful and they were a very small population, or maybe went extinct and there was a second wave or a third wave and so on and so forth that ended up becoming, populating the whole interior continent. And also in the back of my mind, I do remember learning somewhere that in Southeast Asia, I think it's Southeast Asia, there's an absence of stone tip tools prior to Homo sapiens, even though we know like Homo erectus and the Denisovans lived in some of these areas. And the idea there is that they use sharpened bamboo tips for tools. And that, you know, they didn't have hand axes that were those beautiful, like Acheulean hand axes. They were just using sharpened wooden stakes. And Neanderthals, they find those sharpened wooden stakes in Europe with no tips on them. So it is certainly possible that people early on just didn't leave stone tools, at least the ones that
Yeah, I mean,
we
there are sites.
recognize. Mhm.
Sorry.
No, that was it for me.
Oh, I was just say there are sites. I mean, I'm trying to, if maybe it's Wally's Beach or something where you have stone there, but they predates cloves. Looks like people were hunting megafauna, like I think horses and maybe camel. I'm not looking at things now while I'm talking to you, but
mhm,
it has a rather mundane stone component, but sufficient for cutting things and all that.
mm,
So, I'm not the first person to think like that. It's just kind of my take, if you want
mhm.
my take on how these
Um,
conversations proceed through archaeologists even. And a lot of the counter arguments on the white sand stuff are by people who trust the genetic work that, suggest no one should have been here by then by way of some genetic extrapolations of
mhm,
time. And, that's all fine. I like the genetic research a lot for a lot of reasons, but hanging an entire counter argument on the assumptions of genetic timelines is, not going to win the day on
mm.
whether someone was here. Other ideas that are out there is that people came in fits and starts. It
Yeah,
may just may not even be the same. All that's on the table, in my opinion, I guess, as well.
the biggest problem with the genetic one is that the population that perhaps left these footprints in New Mexico may have died out, and they were replaced by subsequent waves after the LGM. Hence the reason why they didn't leave a genetic signal in populations today. I mean, you just cannot rule that out with the genetics alone because of that possibility. So, Daron, I think this was a wonderful conversation. I'm glad I was able to talk to you. For the listeners out there, do you have any papers coming out in the near future that are going to be detailing the findings at Utah that we can look forward to?
Yeah, all the work is done. The contract archaeologist working for the Air Force, so the reporting is done. And so now I've turned my attention to the kind of manuscript we'll send out for peer review, hopefully within the next several months. And then it'll be, widely available. So thanks for the opportunity to sort of outline that here.
Great. So I'll keep an eye out for that paper, probably in the next couple months you're submitting, and maybe published in the next year or so. We know peer review can take a while and the revisions and everything. So I'll keep an eye out for that. And I just want to remind everyone watching this that if you enjoyed the conversation, I'd like you to please subscribe to the channel. All you have to do is click subscribe. It is free. Or like this video, and that helps me and the algorithm so much, so I can get more experts doing amazing science out there for other people to see online on YouTube. You could also leave me a comment below if you have a question, and I'll try to answer every question that comes through. So I want to thank you, Daron, for coming on here and talking with me and letting everyone see this amazing work that you're doing.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right. Bye, everyone.